Well, good evening. My name is Reverend Nancy Wilson, and I'm the proud pastor of Suncoast Metropolitan Community Church and the former moderator of MCC Worldwide. So thank you for this opportunity to share some stories. They're my experiences. They're not in the context of a sermon, so I may be a little less careful than I might be in a sermon, a little more frank, and I'm relying on my memory, which is generally pretty good, but don't hold me to everything. Those of you out there who may remember things differently or better than I do. When I've been thinking about this talk, I was thinking about a theme that I've always been fascinated by social movements and institutions as vehicles for social change, and I've really lived that experience in MCC. MCC is both a movement, which means a group of people who are driven by passion, often loosely organized, idealistic, sometimes sparked by some terrible injustice that they're overcoming. And MCC is also an institution, which means something that is more structured with norms and values and a mission and vision. The strongest and healthiest institutions continually change and get subverted in a good way by movements that happen within them, that call them back to their ideals. MCC's strength and resiliency is partly reflected in the ways we have taken on institutions, government, criminal justice, churches, and we've been a catalyst for change, marriage equality, justice, so many other issues. So I want to start by talking about how I came to MCC. In 1972, I graduated from college. I moved to Boston to go to Boston University School of Theology, to go to seminary, which they had not been accepting women. And in 1972, they were starting to accept women. And then, of course, I came out as a lesbian, which, of course, they were not accepting lesbians. I moved there with my first partner, Jerry, and a gay male friend. And no one had ever been openly LGBT at Boston University School of Theology. I was the very first one. I couldn't imagine how you would be in seminary and lie. And so that, within me, just I came out, and partly because I was not continuing to be a Methodist, because I found MCC in the first 3 weeks I was there, they let me stay. And they had a heck of a time trying to challenge an openly gay student in an institution that, to say the least, frowned upon it. It was late September, early October. There was a radio show called Gay Way Radio. And Emerson College professor Elaine Noble was the host. She would later become the first openly LGBT elected official in the country ever. Before Harvey Milk, she was elected to the state as a state representative in Massachusetts. And she had a show called Gateway Radio, and my two roommates, my partner and my roommate, were listening to it, and they suddenly called me over. You got to hear what this guy is saying. She had a young man named Larry Bernier on her show, and he talked about starting an MCC church in Boston. Never heard of MCC, didn't know what it was about. Larry was a real force of nature. And this radio show changed my life. He asked, if there's a woman out there, preferably one who's in seminary, who would help me start this church, please call me. I did, and he showed up at my doorstep the next day. In the pouring rain, we went and got a cup of coffee. He couldn't afford to buy me lunch, and that should give me a clue about MCC ministry, but there you go. He introduced me at church that Sunday, said, "This is our new assistant pastor. Reverend, can I use your last name?" "Yes, Wilson." That was exactly how it went. And Elaine Noble was there that first Sunday. So Larry then took me to a store the next week, Jordan Marsh, downtown Boston, and bought me my first clerical collar and shirt. At that time, there were kind of no rules in MCC about how that happened. Larry thought I should wear one since he was wearing one. And the first woman I ever saw in a collar was myself in a mirror. Months later, Larry and I were at the altar in Boston, and a man came running up as I was starting to consecrate communion. He slapped me, punched me hard in the face, knocked over all the elements. that was a powerful learning moment for me, and Larry was my teacher. As people came, he ran out of the building immediately, and as people came running forward, Larry said, "Stop, sit down." So everybody sat down. He took a cup and he poured more juice back in it. He set up the communion. He said, "Please continue." Didn't say, "How are you?" or anything like that. Obviously, I was standing, so I must be fine. And he was really telling me that as a woman, a lesbian, out wearing a collar, I was defying thousands of years of institutional taboos, breaking rules, and he was helping me to learn to steel myself and not to flinch. If you're going to do all that, you've got to be hardy. And I appreciated his focus and how amazing he was as a leader. That fall, 1972, lesbians and gay men, and we really didn't talk much about transgender people or bisexual people in those days. There were at least two or three or four gay subcultures. There were very few spaces that men and women shared. MCC was one of those few spaces, or trying to be. The bars were all owned by the mafia, another institution, by the way, and they paid off the police and vice cops so that lesbians and gay men could go to a bar at some point. There were radical lesbian feminist groups and a working class older group called Daughters of Blindness. Anybody here ever remember Daughters of Blindness? Blindness was a disciple of Sappho and the lesbian poet. And Daughters of Blindness was an organization found, I think, in the late 50s, early 60s. It was part of the wave of first out LGBT movements or groups, and it became its own little kind of institution. And there were DOB chapters all over the United States and Canada. They met in Cambridge, in Boston, but they did not publish where they met. You had to call a number, and they told you, go to the Roy Rogers hamburger stand in Harvard Square and wait there, and someone will come for you. So I did that. Now, there's tremendous irony in the Roy Rogers hamburger stand, because as a child in the 50s, as a lesbian kid in the 50s, I loved Roy Rogers. What a sweet cowboy he was, my role model. My best friend, Gail, who was short and petite, and we spent all our time together, and after school, we'd change our clothes and run out, and she'd say, "Let's play Roy Rogers and Dale Evans." "I'm Dale Evans." So I say, "Oh, shucks, ma'am, I guess I'll be Roy." That was a lot of our childhood. And when I was about 6, I was on the playground at school, and they had installed new swings. And the swings were horses. Oh, perfect, right? So one day, I snuck my cowboy hat. It was a cowboy hat. Gail had a cowgirl hat. I had a cowboy hat. And I put my cowboy hat into my book bag. Then at recess, I took it out, put on my cowboy hat, marched out to the horse, climbed onto the horse. Now, I am wearing a dress, mind you. So keep that in mind. But I was trying to ignore that, but I've got my cowboy hat, I'm riding my horse into the sunset, and I got busted. And I got busted by my teacher and sent home for, I guess, gender disobedience. I'm not sure what the crime was exactly. And I don't remember my parents having any reaction at all to it. But I do remember that moment of being very happy in how I was looking and what I was doing, and being interrupted by that. So there was an irony in being at the Roy Rogers hamburger stand in the pouring rain, and this woman comes in. Now, she should have been wearing a cowboy hat. I'm telling you, she was very cute. She spotted me, and she looked me over and said, "Come with me." So I passed a test of some kind, and I followed her, and it took me the back way into a lounge at Harvard Law School dorm, where there were 60 lesbians gathered at a Daughters of Blindness meeting. There were my lesbians. I had finally found them. Well, now fast forward 9 years. By this time, I'm living in Los Angeles, and I'm working at MCC's headquarters. I'd been an elder since 1976, and this was 1979-80. I was full-time working for Reverend Troy Perry. It was about 1980, right before AIDS. Now, working for Troy was amazing and exciting. He traveled a lot, and whenever he came back into town, he was full of ideas and things that we should do. He was a total extrovert, is a total extrovert, entrepreneur, a movement leader. We had to build the institution and implement whatever he said, try to get it done, but he was the idea and energy and the cheerleader for everything. In 1980, some of you may remember this, some of you may not, there was the Muriel Boatlift from Cuba when Jimmy Carter was president his last year. The Cuban economy had taken a downturn, and people were wanting to leave in droves, and Castro agreed with the president and several other countries to do this, but Castro also took the opportunity to empty some of his prisons and mental hospitals. About 125,000 people emigrated. They started in Miami and other places in the U.S. Some people in the U.S. said that Castro was emptying the trash, getting rid of undesirables. And of course, gays and lesbians were part of that trash he was taking out, part of the criminal class. And the truth is, of course, in the U.S., we were still part of the criminal class. Some of you may know, in 1974, not long before this, MCC in Indianapolis held its first worship service in the home of the pastor, which was raided by the police because in 1974 it was illegal for homosexuals to assemble in Indiana and in many other places. And we've come an incredibly long way. But Ronald Reagan and the Republicans used this as one more thing with which to beat up Jimmy Carter, who wanted to find a way to take in these refugees. Well, of course, Troy immediately sees the connection. Here are these gay Cuban refugees. For him, they're our community. They're our sisters and brothers, and we've got to help them in some way. Now, they were sent to FEMA camps and to Army camps and places around the country. And if you want to look it up, just look up Muriel Boatlift Gay, and you'll see articles from the Philadelphia Gay News, and they talk about MCC and have pictures of some of these refugees. Now, FEMA was a little desperate. They had no idea what to do with gay refugees. This was scary to FEMA. So an MCC pastor, Reverend Bob Arthur, became the first MCC minister employed by FEMA. He was our prison minister at our headquarters. He was tapped by FEMA to help resettle the refugees. Bob moved to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, and did intakes with many, many hundreds and hundreds of these gay refugees, maybe even thousands. From there, MCC churches and pastors signed up to take on or take a refugee or two or three in our congregations into people's homes. My pastor, Reverend Jean Hart, from our little church in the San Fernando Valley, De Colores MCC, she took in a lesbian woman who had been in prison in Cuba just for being a lesbian, an amazing, wonderful woman. Many of the LGBT refugees had been in prison just for being gay or in mental hospitals. MCC in the Valley, in Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, Miami, Baltimore, and others took people into our homes, and that first wave went pretty well. When Bob Arthur came back home for Thanksgiving in LA, Paula and I invited him and 5 Cuban refugees to join us for Thanksgiving that year. And then a second wave of Cuban refugees immigration happened, which included more LGBT folks who also had serious addiction, mental illness, other issues. As the camps filled up, FEMA decided to use the halfway house model instead of housing people in people's homes. Remember, MCC was only 12 or 13 years old at this time. as an institution, very young. And we had no money. And we were very naive. So, groups in 3 cities, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, based in MCC, but also with other people from the community, decided they wanted to make a joint proposal to resettle and have halfway houses in each of these 3 cities. And asked MCC, we were the only one that was a nonprofit, we had that we would submit the grant to FEMA for 3 houses in Philadelphia, Chicago, and Baltimore. MCC was the agency and applied for the grant. I don't remember being involved actually at all in that way. I don't know who Troy asked to do that, but I think the Chicago group was probably taking the leadership and did this. And of course, we outbid others. We didn't ask for nearly enough money from FEMA. But there we went. The Philadelphia group rented a house, of course, spent money on renting a house, a couple of months' rent in advance, hired staff, did everything they could do, and the refugees began to arrive. Now remember, this is a little rougher group, and MCCers and the staff and pastors, they were actually not very prepared for this. After a month or so, maybe 3 months into the project, they burned the house down, and the refugees scattered. Project closed. Then there was Baltimore. Reverend Dolores Berry was the pastor at that time. Some of you remember Dolores. They secured a house and staff. They were really starting to get everything going, up and ready. And then the city and neighbors in the city decided to oppose FEMA and us to have this house there. So there was lawyers, there was a court case, there was a stalemate, and after several months, of course, no more money, and the project was done. Fortunately, Chicago turned out to be the star. They had more experienced leaders and staff. They got city support. They raised additional funds. They settled more folks. Problems were managed. And I think they ended up settling and helping as many refugees as we wanted to have in the whole program. They did a superb job. They went longer and farther than we had even hoped. And, we reported out on the programs. Done. Okay. Case closed. A year later, I'm at the MCC headquarters. Reverend Perry is traveling somewhere. So there I am. And someone from FEMA comes knocking at the door. Well, they want their money back from the 2 projects that failed. Now, the total amount we got for all 3 projects was $100,000. Can you imagine that? I mean, think about all those things I just, FEMA was in emergency crisis mode. We had responded. But as he's talking, I'm starting to picture myself in jail attire. And so I started thinking, I need to go on the offensive here a little bit. I don't know what else to do. And I was about 31 at the time. And I said, so were there other programs that were more successful than we were? I said. He kind of looked, and I imagine they gave millions of dollars to other agencies to do this. How did they do? I said, well. I said, well, look around our offices. You can see that we did not spend the money on our office furniture or equipment. That money was spent on startup issues that we couldn't control or foresee, and FEMA was not able to help us. So we settled the number of refugees we promised just in one place. I said, so you're going to have to sue us or arrest me or something, but I don't have a better answer for you than that. Shortly afterwards, he got up and left. I never heard from him or FEMA again. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense. So I think of lessons from that we were naive. We had never dealt with government like that before. We were still a criminal class in the USA. And yet the government was happy to use us when they wanted to. Troy's passionate ideals and beliefs that these were our brothers and sisters inspired us. He thought we can do anything. Today, there are MCC churches in Cuba, young and vibrant activist in a very different Cuba. Reverend Perry has visited there. He's been honored by people in Cuba for his work. And it's amazing the change that can happen. From the movement perspective, I think as an institution so young, we put ourselves on the line. We risked a lot more than we probably knew we were risking to do what we thought was the right thing. Then I'm going to talk about my encounters with church leaders. So, some of you remember Father John McNeil. He was a Jesuit priest who wrote the book The Church and the Homosexual in 1974. He was a hero of LGBT Catholics and of all of us. He eventually came out with his pastor of over 50 years, Charlie Ciccarelli. John died several years ago after a long struggle with the Catholic Church. In 1977 and then 83, he was silenced by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. John did not keep that silence. And in 1987, Cardinal Ratzinger had him expelled from the Jesuit order for pertinacious disobedience. I love that. Don't you love that? Pertinacious disobedience. It broke John's heart to be separated from his Jesuit brethren. John had challenged the institution of the Catholic Church with his disobedience and paid a price. At the same time, in 1987, Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger came to South Carolina and held a big ecumenical service with 500 Protestant and Orthodox leaders. The actress Helen Hayes read the scripture. Troy and I were there at the invitation of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which means that some gay priest in charge of invitations had a mischievous moment and added us to the list just for fun. That kind of thing happened all the time. We loved it. Now, Troy tells the story of how I shaved my legs to see the Pope, and that's his story, and I'm not going to tell it here. But in that day, we were crowded, 500 of us, into this room, some kind of a reception room. We were only supposed to be in there a short time, but there were Secret Service and police and state police and probably Vatican police, who knows. And we were cooped up, and there was a hurricane happening in Miami, and so the Pope was delayed by 5 hours. So the service supposed to happen at 1 or 2 was going to happen at 6 or 7. And it was South Carolina. The air conditioning was not adequate. And in 1987, AIDS was raging through our community. So Troy and I had this idea that we would wear these really big, remember big campaign buttons, a big campaign button, and it said, "God is greater than AIDS." Of course, we had no idea we'd be cooped up for 5 hours with these people. We didn't know that there was one other LGBT person or friendly person in the room. People would come up to us and say, "Oh, God is greater than AIDS." They would back away from us, literally. And they all had the look of, how did they get in here, It was that gay priest who worked for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And so, of course, there was no social distancing allowed. So, they had to be way closer than they were comfortable being with people who thought God is greater than AIDS. Next day, the Lutheran Catholic dialogue on communion was held. They had been talking for 40 years, the Lutherans and the Catholics, about who celebrates communion, what the words are, what the right words are, what our theology. That day, they unveiled that was a profound truth, which they said that they thought perhaps it was human beings who had created these divisions among churches and not God. And I remember thinking, duh, I've been in MCC too long already. I can't even imagine why people think this. But there at the conference was my friend Jean Audrey Powers, who is a very powerful, prominent Methodist woman of blessed memory in the closet, an ecumenist who traveled the world, and who knew Cardinal Ratzinger. They also called him the Rottweiler, by the way. But of course, Jean Audrey, she was in the closet to herself, but of course everyone knew she was a lesbian. If she'd been at that Roy Rogers hamburger stand, she would have passed and been taken to the lounge as well. She often mentored me at these ecumenical meetings, told me the inside information, and then she takes my hand, and we go up to this little fellow, and she says, Cardinal Ratzinger, I want to introduce you to someone very special. Cardinal Ratzinger, this is Reverend Nancy Wilson, who is the ecumenical officer for Metropolitan Community Churches, and someday she's going to be the leader of Metropolitan Community Churches, she was prophesying. And she said, you know, Cardinal, the gay church, just like that. And so there we are, you know. So I put out my hand. He gingerly reaches out his delicate, sweaty hand. You know, I regret I didn't speak to him about John McNeil. It was a little like meeting the Grand Inquisitor, you know, so you kind of, but I kind of wished I'd added a comment. And little did I know, 18 years later, that small, sweaty hand would belong to Pope Benedict XVI, formerly known as Cardinal Ratzinger. So now I'm thinking about prisoners. I don't know, since I was a child, I've always been very, very attracted to movies about prisons. I think because in prisons, cruelty is crueler and mercy is sweeter. So all the great, you know, Shawshank Redemption and everything else in between, all those movies, The Birdman of Alcatraz, I can think of many, many titles. I was always fascinated, though I never knew anyone who'd been in jail or prison until I came to MCC. It's something MCC gave me, that opportunity. In 1975 in Worcester, Massachusetts, I was pastor there. And you may remember the Weather Underground. There was a fugitive from a 1970 bank robbery in which a police officer was killed. Susan Sachs was a college student, and she was with these bank robbers who were part of a kind of radical group that was trying to fund radical causes. And she eluded capture and spent 5 years in Philadelphia. She was a lesbian, and she hid out in the lesbian community. When she was captured, she was sent to a prison near us in Worcester, and lesbians from Philadelphia contacted us and came and stayed in my home while they visited Susan. They stayed loyal to her and loved her and were with her. One of our deacons got permission to hold a women's Bible study in that prison that Susan Sachs attended just as a way to be able to see people. Our phones were tapped during that time, and I know it, not just because you'd hear a little click, click, click going on the phone, but sometimes we'd actually hear our conversation played back. The equipment wasn't that good in those days. And then I moved to Detroit, and there was something called the Detroit House of Correction in 1976. I was just newly the pastor there, and a woman from Detroit House of Correction wrote to me and said she was a lesbian, and could I come visit her? And I let that letter sit on my desk a couple of days, and then I wrote back to her and said, yeah, sure, tell me. I don't know how to do that. I'd never been in a jail or prison before. I sent the letter to her, and 3 weeks later it came back with a stamp that said deceased. They had a stamp that said deceased for letters, okay? That'd give you a clue, right? And then we started getting letters from Jackson State Prison in Jackson, Michigan. The first one was from young Kenneth Brown, a lifer. He was only 23 years old. He'd been in prison for 5 or maybe 6 years. And we sent a visiting team. We had a few people who wanted to visit. It was 90 miles away, the largest walled prison in the world, at least 5,000 inmates. Soon, we had more requests than we could handle. We were visiting 10, 15 prisoners at a time when we went up. And the prison officials were just, here's these gay men, and mostly lesbians visiting these gay. They could not figure it out. They couldn't figure it out that we had Troy Perry's spirit of, these are our brothers. Eventually, we were corresponding with and visiting 70 prisoners in Jackson State Prison. It was large enough to hold a worship service, we thought, once a month. And so we asked the prison. They said no. The guys in Jackson, they took up offerings of cigarettes and makeup and got it to men who were in the hole and helped out guys who were depressed or isolated. They prayed for each other. They looked out for each other. They couldn't wait to tell us when we visited with them the ways in which they'd been able to impact each other's lives. They just got MCC immediately. But the prison did not want us to be there. They said it wasn't safe for the men to gather. Of course, it's their job to make it safe. These men had religious freedom, but... So we sued them in 1977 or 78, and it went all the way to federal court. So by now, we're in institutions suing another institution. There we go. Now, the background to this is that MCC had sued in California, the prisons there, for the right to hold worship service, and we had won. And so for many, many years, MCC had very viable prison ministries in many of the state prisons, eventually in women's prisons in California that I did ministry in, and amazing stories. So we felt very buoyed by the fact that they'd sued and won in California, and we were going to sue and win in Michigan. By the time the case got resolved in federal court, I was living in Los Angeles. I had moved. I had to raise all the money for the attorneys that we used as it climbed its way through. Our church in Detroit had kind of had its own crises and had moved on from doing this ministry. Some of the prisoners who had been so involved had been moved deliberately to other prisons. Some had died. Some just disappeared in the system, Kenny included. Finally, in about 1986, the 9th District Court of Appeals ruled. We won the right to serve communion one-on-one or in small groups, but not to hold worship services in the prison. So I flew back to Michigan and drove to Jackson. They let me in, and I met with 2 men that I had visited 9 years before. I brought communion with me. One was a Christian. I believe he was transgender. The other had grown up Muslim, but not practicing. He said to me, well, you know, Muslims revere Jesus, he said. And I had communion with me. So I spent some time with him he said, I want to receive communion. And I thought about MCC's value of open communion, and that this was not my decision to make. It was his choice to make. And so we prayed. And I think so much about how these brave men created a movement within the institution of Jackson State Prison, the largest walled prison in the United States, as they attached themselves to a young and fragile MCC institution. After nearly a decade, this was the only redress the only justice they received. 3 of us sharing communion, not a dry eye, and it was the last time I ever saw them. My last story is about President Obama. I have a couple of thoughts about President Obama. The main one I want to tell is about Obama and my mama, and my mother. President Obama had invited me to read the scripture at the second inaugural prayer service in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. I was the first openly gay person ever to participate in a kind of service that it had since George Washington, inaugural prayer service. And so it was his second inauguration, and I remember the phone call coming into our office in Sarasota, and Linda said, "It's the White House on the phone for you, you know." So it was Joshua Du Bois, who was the religion staff at the White House, and he said, "Reverend Wilson, are you coming to the inauguration?" Well, you know, it's like 2 degrees out, and it's a week away, and you know, it's like I didn't think I could really do that. So I said, "Well," and he said, "Well, the president's asked me to ask you if you would read, you know, the scripture at his inaugural prayer service." Yes, I'll be there. In fact, I'm planning to be there. Yes. And so, you know, we arrived that morning at the cathedral, and it was below zero. It was so freezing, and you know, but and those of us who were fortunate enough got to go inside early. Everybody else had to stand and wait outside to get in. But it was great because there were MCCers all over the sanctuary, and they were, you know, taking photographs and posting them on Facebook and everything else. But we spent about an hour underground in the cathedral because the Secret Service has to sweep the whole entire place. And so we waited an hour, and then in walks the President and Mrs. Obama and Vice President Biden and Mrs. Biden, Dr. Biden, and there were those of us participating in the service, one of whom was Adam Hamilton. We've read a lot of his books and studied, and he was the preacher for the day. And he was very kind to me, knew all about MCC. But the president and the vice president and their wives took an individual picture with each of us. And my one memory, I'm standing in between the vice president and the president, and of course the president's very tall, but I kind of never had an idea of how thin he was until, you know, we're all very close, and, you know, and so we're holding each other so that we get the picture, and I suddenly feel so self-conscious that I am putting my arm around the waist of the President of the United States, and I feel so awkward, and so I shouldn't be doing it. My hand went, I mean, it was like almost all the way around. I thought, he's so skinny, oh my gosh, you know, and I'm thinking you shouldn't be thinking these things. Just, you know, smile, do whatever you do, but it was just, it was so awkward, but he was so kind, and his kindness just showed in all kinds of ways. You know, people talk about him in different ways, and sometimes, you know, they'd called him Spock or different kinds of things, that he was kind of cold, but I never experienced him that way, ever. And I was at a meeting in Texas, and I got a message that I'd been invited to a White House Christmas party. Now, I'd been invited to the Christmas party the year before, and I'd taken Paula. She was very happy to have gone and done that. But I thought this time maybe I could take my mom. And my mom was still traveling then, but, you know, still just barely. So I flew home on a Thursday night, and I said to Mom, "You're going to be a jet setter today." So we had a flight like at about 6:30 in the morning. I said, "Be ready." And of course my mother was ready, but of course she could not wear the clothes she was going to wear to the White House on the plane. People in my mother's generation, they did not do that. So she had a, you know, thing bag, and she had the jacket she'd borrowed from a friend next door who gave her a beautiful kind of Christmassy jacket that she just loved. And So, we get on the plane, we go all the way fly to Washington, D.C., and, about 10 o'clock we're there, and so I had a friend who was a lobbyist, and he had a beautiful office, and so we went there, my mother changed, got in her clothes, we went and had a little lunch, and then 2:30 was the party. And so we got there, and it was just decorated beautifully, and, for my mom it was such a treat. And so we got there, and we met, you meet some cabinet members and different people, and, some Congress people. It was really lovely, several hundred people, and I could tell my mom was getting tired. And then you waited a rope line, and so I'm pushing to get close to the rope line, as close as I can, and she's saying, "Oh, it's okay, don't." I said, "Mom, we're doing this." And I said, "Lean on me if you need to," and she did. She had to lean on me because she'd been standing too long, And finally, after an hour or so, Mrs. Obama comes down right by the rope line, and, we get to see her. Oh my gosh, and she in person, she is much more charismatic than he is, totally. She absolutely fills a room and has this immense, enormous star power feeling. By comparison, he's quiet and staid, but he starts coming through the line, and people are yelling, and just it parted a little bit, and he saw me, and he said, "Thank you." He said, "Thank you for your service." I was on the President's Faith Commission, and we've been working on the issue of human trafficking for a couple of years, and so I'd been in meetings with him and with the team, and so he said that, and then here's my mother, and so I think, I want him to say hello to my mother, and so then I do what I might never have done elsewhere, and I reached over and I grabbed his upper arm, and I think they're going to throw me down on the floor. Something bad is going to happen, but I reached, I grabbed, and I said, "Oh, Mr. President, I just want to introduce you to my mother." Now, with all the crowds pressing and how fast they were moving, I don't know how time-wise this actually worked, but I said, "Mr. President, I want to introduce you to your mother." And he turned completely and looked at my mother, and he said, "Well, all moms deserve a kiss," he said. And he kissed my mother on the cheek. My mother turned to me. She looked like she was 15, and just seen Frank Sinatra, when she was, and she just kind of looked at me, it was like, and my brother, my one brother Dave said to me, it was right before Christmas, of course, he said, how are we going to compete with that for a Christmas present? Forget about it, So we got home probably 10 o'clock at night. My mother was just, and then I had to fly the next morning to Joplin, Missouri, where they had just been devastated by a tornado, and to meet with the people there and preach and come home Sunday night. But I think my mother loved telling that story, especially to her. She volunteered from the Democratic Party in Bradenton. And so at those lunches, she was very popular for having this amazing story. And so I was very, very honored and thankful to have the opportunity to serve a wonderful president, and to have the chance to bring my mother to the White House and to have him kiss my mama. So thank you. That's it. Questions? Thoughts? All right.
I have a question.
Okay.
How did your faith take flight, and how did that interact with your sexuality?
Yeah. Well, I was, from the time I was pretty young, I had a strong faith sensibility. And I've shared about a crisis I had as a young person, and feeling God's presence and not really knowing quite what that meant. I think something in my mind and psyche kind of, it was like my mind wouldn't really let me face that I was a lesbian until I was in college. I was well into college. Even though all the signs were there, the Roy Rogers thing, there's so many more stories. I played Abraham Lincoln in my class play when I was 10, and it was one of the happiest moments of my life to cross-dress and be Abraham Lincoln. And so, but I was clueless at some level. And I think maybe it was my mind and heart's way of catching up with itself. I knew that this would be devastating to my parents, 1972, there was no, Dr. Phil wasn't talking about it then, or, even the other Phil guy who was, had TV shows, and, it wasn't really happening very much. When I came home that summer and I had come out to my parents, I went to see the pastor at Methodist Church, and he was clueless, and he was a lovely person, but oh my, he did not know, and I knew immediately, this guy just doesn't get it. And I didn't know MCC at that point, but I somehow I knew in myself that this was who I was and had always been. And I didn't grow up in fundamentalism or in a very judgmental religious setting, and I'm thankful for that, because I think that's what often really takes people a long time. And, I told the pastor, just take care of my parents. They really need support. I'm fine, I said, And, I don't know if I was fine or not, but 3 or 4 weeks into joining MCC, maybe a month, I was celebrating communion. This was before the incident, but maybe about 40 people in the room, and celebrating communion. And they started playing Jesus Loves Me, This I Know, which I had not heard since I was a child. And I felt like at that moment, things just really came together. And whatever part of me was still not sure, how did I end up here, what is going on? But I felt like, I also felt like coming out meant, for the first time I had a body, and I had a whole self. And all of those things just reinforced that, I'd been with my partner 4 months, and we'd never danced together until we went to this little gay bar in Boston, the 1270 on Boylston Street. I still remember. And, and I remember dancing for the first time and thinking, this is why people like to dance. So all that sense of being embodied and being free. I think MCC gave me freedom as a very young person. Freedom sometimes to break the rules, freedom to explore and be, and I never looked back, and I was so young. I think sometimes when you're young, you take chances that maybe when you're 40 is harder to take. You have a mortgage, you have kids or family, other things. I didn't have any of that, I was broke, and it was okay if I was broke for a long time after that. It didn't matter. But yeah.
We have another question.
Sure.
It says, Reverend Nancy, thank you for sharing these stories. Do you have any plans to write another book, perhaps capture some of these wonderful stories for the future generation? Yolanda, she doesn't know that I've been threatening you, does she?
Yeah. Oh, I'd love to write another book. So, yeah, it's, it just takes time. And but I've been thinking about different ways to do that. A book is a way to tell stories. That's what I figure. So I hope to do that. Yeah. Yeah.
Tell us about one of the most profound things for you traveling internationally with MCC.
Yeah.
Please.
So one of my favorite stories is I went to Romania for the first time, about 10 years ago, I'd say. And we have a wonderful activist, Florin Buhuceno, who's there and doing all kinds of civil rights and human rights work in Eastern Europe and supporting LGBT Christians. So Florin arranged for me to speak at the University of Bucharest to a women's feminist studies class of some, mostly straight women, presumably, and to speak on the issue of reproductive freedom for women and faith, and to try to put that together. And he said because they will never have heard a clergy person speak about this, and they will never have heard a woman clergy speak about this. So I had some background in dealing with these issues, and so I went to the university. There's about 60, 70 women in this class, very young women. And so I gave my speech on the topic and then asked questions, and they didn't want to talk about that at all. They wanted to talk about, my being a woman minister. They were just fascinated. And they talked about how unhappy they were in their church, that they felt like they couldn't relate to anything, especially Orthodox church, and that they talked about nightmare stories of wedding counseling and, advice to women, and how they were totally, totally alienated from religion and faith, and that they had not imagined that there was another way to talk about faith. And they cried, they told stories. We were, there. We were there for another hour and a half in this classroom, and and I thought halfway through, if I had 3 more weeks here, we could have a church right here in Bucharest with these women. I mean, they were so. I want to go to a church like this. I want to be part of. I feel like I don't have a faith. I feel like, the church doesn't see me for who I am and value me. And incredible, extraordinary young women in college, trying to make a way for themselves in a place. There's one little point to this too, that in Romania, this was a time when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and she had said that gay rights are human rights, and so that the ambassadors around the world were supposed to be supportive of human rights, including LGBT rights, because of that. So when I was there, I met the ambassador and his staff, which included a transgender woman who ran the only transgender support group out of the U.S. Embassy at night. And she said she really had to school the guards to help them understand what was happening. And the U.S. ambassador, they had several pride parades in Romania where there was a lot of violence, where thousands of radical Orthodox would be throwing stones and trying to hurt, a couple hundred people marching in a pride parade. So the U.S. ambassador, the next year, and his wife marched with the marchers. And then they opened their home that day for a reception for all of the marchers. And so when you think, what matters and how elections matter, you think about how it mattered that the U.S. was seen as a beacon of hope for LGBT people in these places. Yeah. Thank you. Great. Yeah.
As we move into a post-pandemic environment, what do you think is the most significant challenge that we'll face as MCC together as we move into this current political climate and as we move into a post-pandemic environment? What do you see as our biggest challenge?
Well, our message has to be clear, and that there is still unfinished business for MCC. That there are still people who really don't have a clue that they could be who they are, whether they're a straight women student in Bucharest or queer or whoever they are, and to say there's still work to be done. Most churches in the world, most Christians in the world, most churches do not accept openly LGBT people. The world is an increasingly dangerous, volatile place, and everywhere there are refugees, there are LGBT refugees. In every country and place, especially where the church has been, there's often oppression, and that has to be healed and repaired. And there are an awful lot of young people in the world who still wonder, am I okay? And can God love me if there is a God? And increasingly younger people are alienated from traditional views of God. And I think we have something extraordinary. I think we have a different face of Christ to share. And as long as we do that, I think that there's always work for us to do. No matter, whatever resources we have and can muster, there's always work for us to do. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for showing up. Thanks for being here.